these are the Addison dashboards. So currently 12 vehicles up, but we can change the time filter out there to go back a little bit longer, and we'll see additional vehicles pop up here as well as being online. So there's a time filter in the top, so that's saying how far back into history or what time range we're looking at for the data that's being displayed on the screen. We have our list of assets on the left-hand side here. So this one's in an elevated state. These are in nominal states. These are offline because they haven't checked in the time filter, but now we're looking back 2 days. So there's only one asset that hasn't checked in the last 2 days. And then we have our system diagnostics here. So one of the assets has a has below 25% fuel level. One of them probably got parked on a slope, and so we have a large fuel consumption detected during evaluation. So we disregard that, knowing that that was an errant reading from the fuel level sensor. So that's for vehicle CO2 purposes. We've got some other things saying you need to replace your air filter. So air filters reached the end of life, replaced with this part number or similar. And then some other alerts regarding mileage limits for vehicles. Below this, there is a predictions list. So a prediction will normally pop up prior to when a diagnostic alert occurs saying, hey, you're about to hit this. You might want to take action to prevent it. And so from the selected assets page, we can select any asset that we want to on here. I'm going to pick, I think 903 is usually a good one to look at. So we'll go into asset 903, and since it is the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, these guys are more than likely not driving right now. So let me zoom back a little bit. So we have our odometer reading on here, miles traveled within the time filter. So in the last 2 days, this particular asset has traveled 23 miles. We have a map on here, but I need to talk about the map for a moment. So you'll notice how there are some suspiciously straight lines on this map. So this is the central hub for the Addison home base and their service center right here. And you see a lot of straight lines out to intersections and things like that. The way the GPS data gets produced to the system right now, the CalAmp data comes to us in a streaming fashion, essentially, but the model processes it every 3 minutes. So every sharp edge on here, every corner is a 3-minute interval. If a client says, hey, that's okay, don't need to worry about that, then we don't need to change that. But if they say, hey, we would like some more fidelity into the map, then we need to increase the rate at which the model evaluates. So that would be an AOS cloud setting. You would change it from 180 seconds to maybe 60 seconds would be sufficient for the level of fidelity that they need. And then we have all the individual subsystems down here. So suspension and chassis, fuel system, cooling, engine and transmission, electrical system, and then the vehicle CO2 management and tracking. So in the suspension and chassis portion, this will tell you your tire health as well as your remaining tire mileages on here and any alerts specifically pertaining to the suspension and chassis module. In the fuel system alerts, sorry, let me expand that time range back out. Anytime you change pages, it'll reset. So this will tell you your last known fuel level, average fuel rate, average fuel economy, as well as, again, specific components pertaining to the fuel system and then alerts pertaining to the fuel system. Cooling system, same sort of thing here again. So it'll tell you your radiator temperature. And so what the system does in the background, so for those that are curious as to why it says 201 degrees across, multiple days here, it'll use the last known value. So when the vehicle shuts off, the CalAmp device does not continue running and say, okay, yeah, it's trending down over time, and then it's quiet when the vehicle's off, and then, okay, you turn the vehicle back on, it ramps up again. It's gonna not report the values when the vehicle's off until it checks in. And it only checks in once a day, and it only provides a minimum amount of information. This is to save any risk of draining the battery on the vehicle. It's not a large risk. They're rather low-power devices, but it's a risk that we want to mitigate if we can. Which is fine, because really at the end of the day, we want to know operating temperature. So looks like for this vehicle, it's between 190 and 201 degrees, a great range. Or we want to know when it crosses into a critical range, so above 235 or so degrees. On the engine and transmission side of things, we have our engine RPM history. And also for any of those that have used like data analysis systems for racing vehicles in the past, it's the same sort of thing where you can scroll in on a particular range of time here. So I'm just dragging the cursor over, clicking, and then pulling to the time range that I want to look at. So now we're looking at November 22nd between 2 and 4 o'clock essentially. And so he did a good amount of driving in that time. Only 5% of the time he spent idling and drove for close to an hour. So this is great as far as Addison's concerned. We again have our component mileage remaining over here. If the asset is on currently, or during this time, it'll show ignition on, but the last data point recorded in this time span was ignition off. If it's running, it'll give you estimates for the BMAP, the brake horsepower, and the brake torque, and again, engine alerts and predictions there. And so before I go into the vehicle CO2 portion, there's one other bit to look at on here as I re-expand this time filter out to 2 days. My computer will cooperate. So we have a logs page here. So anything that has ever been generated for this asset in terms of alerts or predictions, if you go into the logs page, a full history of that will be available there. As well as down here is the full component life remaining list. So everything we track across the vehicle, all the way from the air filter, all the way down to the water pump and everything in between, we track the mileage on and degrade where we know how to degrade that item accordingly. And now this is the system that has gotten the most traction, I would say, in recent months. So this is the vehicle CO2 portion. So our total emissions up here across all of Addison's fleet in the last 2 days is about 300 kilograms. So this is looking at how much diesel fuel has been burned, how much gasoline fuel has been burned, and then aggregating it into this dashboard. It also provides a driving profile. So we have idle time versus loaded time, and a cumulative emissions piece. But for those more eagle-eyed, you all have already noticed that 123 kilograms and 58 kilograms between idle and loaded does not add up to 300. The model has some difficulty with distinguishing between states, and there's some filters working in the background to make sure that we only count things that we know we should count and don't provide false positives. So there's some future development to be done to make this work correctly, but it's a good indication, generally speaking, of how the vehicle is being used, and obviously across all of Addison's fleet, where in the last 2 days, their total vehicle fleet, so there's over 20 vehicles here, they idled for a total of 2.3 days and were loaded for about 24 hours. So there's a pretty poor range there that they would want to try to solve. There's also cumulative emissions over time, so you can see, this is during the night and then during the day when they're really working hard in the morning, and then they finally drive back in the evening. What we can also do with the time filter is if we come up here to the 2 section of it and we hit, let's say, plus 21 days, 21D, caps lock's on, apply time range, it'll forecast out based on the prior trend what you're going to hit in that time. Let me double check that I'm still recording. Okay, we're good. So it's going to forecast that out. They'll hit somewhere 4.5, Jesus. It's early in the morning still, I apologize. 4.15 megagrams of CO2 emissions in a 21-day span based on the last 2 days of history. And so now I need to look at just one asset in isolation for this bottom portion here. And we'll go ahead and look at the last 2 days again. So this is just looking at that asset 903 that we're looking at just a moment ago. So we have our odometer over here. And actually, given that we haven't really driven much, I'll zoom in on this portion. So odometer over here. So they had some nice trends there. There's a fuel map here that will come up here in a second. If you ever see this little spinning, rotating icon, it just means the data is loading there. And so we see our fuel consumption over time. So the fuel percentage is the level on the right-hand side. The fuel consumption is on the left. And so any spikes in the orange chart are times where they were consuming heavy amounts of fuel, essentially. And then we have, again, the driving profile. So idle versus loaded time, fuel miles remaining. So we've got 12 gallons left in the tank. And at a fuel consumption rate of 4.71 gallons per mile, we have 60 miles remaining. And we produce 40 kilograms of fuel over that time span. And total mileage, so mileage within the time filter, same thing as what we saw on the asset homepage, was just under 22 miles. And you also have your odometer here as well. This odometer state piece here that says odometer data received, this is kind of an internal check for us to say, yes, the device is still talking to us. So if you ever see no odometer data on the dashboard here, it's cause to be suspicion. Probably need to go through the troubleshooting steps that we've outlined in some of the trainings as far as going into CTC and pulse and making sure the device is still talking to us.